Hello, welcome to the Cato Institute. My name's Neil McCluskey. I'm the director of the Center for Educational Freedom here at Cato. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Agostina Paglian, who's the author of this terrific new book, Raised to Obey, The Rise and Spread of Mass Education. Paglian is assistant professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego. She's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and has written for numerous major outlets. You can look her up on the internet and find out all sorts of great stuff. That's all the introduction I'm going to give her now, and that's all she, I think, really needs. Just as a reminder, as we move along, you can send questions or comments that you would like to ask if you're online. You can use it on numerous platforms, wherever you're watching, basically. And if you're on X, you can use hashtag CatoCEF to send questions. And so Professor Paglian and I will have a little discussion, and then we'll get to lots of questions and comments. And with that, Professor Paglian.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thanks everyone for being here, for joining online as well. I'm going to give a very brief introduction of the book before we talk about the book in greater depth with Neil. So with that, let me start first with the motivation for writing Raised to Obey. Around the world, what we have seen is that virtually all countries have universal primary education. Kids have the ability to access schools, particularly at the primary education level, but at the same time, there's this skills deficit globally in which what we see is, for instance, roughly 1/3 of children who have 4 years of schooling cannot read a simple sentence. And so I've always been really curious about what lies behind this disconnect between schooling and skills or schooling and learning. And the very common explanation that I heard in previous years working at the World Bank, working at the Center for Education Policy Analysis, was that the primary reason behind the skills deficit is that well-intended politicians simply don't know what works to promote skills, that there's a problem of ignorance on the part of politicians and policymakers about what kinds of education policies are better for promoting skills. And what the book does is it provides a different perspective on this problem of learning, which is a perspective that doesn't necessarily take for granted that politicians are well-intended. What it does is it goes back to the period when state-regulated primary education systems emerged, were created, and it looks at what motivated governments to set up these education systems in the first place. Was it actually driven by an effort to promote skills, or was it driven by a different set of goals? And what are the legacies of those origins of mass education for modern schools? And the bottom line argument of the book is that primary education systems regulated by the state did not emerge to promote skills. The primary reason why governments decided to regulate the education of children was because they were afraid that in the absence of state intervention in primary education, the lower classes in particular and their children would be unruly and savage and barbarian, and they would disrupt the social order, and the state, for its own sake, to maintain political and social stability, had to step in and convert these unruly children into obedient citizens who respected the state and its laws. And so here you have a very short, concise argument, summary of the argument by James Robinson, who just last year won the Nobel Prize in Economics. And he says, the creation of mass education is not about economic productivity, but about state formation and social control. So he summarizes, I think, the book really nicely, pinpointing to this challenge that the book makes to this idea that mass education emerged to promote economic productivity and skills for that. Now, another contribution of the book is to specify when exactly are governments likely to invest in education for this social control purpose. And what the book finds is that it's particularly following episodes of internal conflict or mass violence against the status quo. Those are the episodes that make political elites particularly fearful of the masses and their supposed violent predisposition, and that then forge a coalition of political support for mass mass education regulated by the state for the sake of teaching kids that violence is always wrong, that they should respect the state, respect authority, respect rules. And with the idea that if children learned this very early on to respect rules and authority, they would continue doing so through the remainder of their lives. Just to give you very brief examples of the kinds of things that politicians said when they were drafting these laws of creating a national primary education system. In Prussia, the goal of the law, literally written in the first compulsory schooling law, is to break the child's will, make the kid entirely subservient to the king's authority. In France, it was about improving the moral life of the poor, and the Minister of Education who said this explicitly said, this is not about improving the economic well-being of people. What the state can do is improve the moral values of people, not their economic well-being. In Chile, the president said the goal of our common school system should be to develop habits of order, of submission. In Argentina, the person behind the first primary education law who drafted the law said the goal of education is to engender disgust toward violence. And finally, in the US, just one quote of many different ones, the goal of common schools should be to instill habits of obedience and subordination. So just to give you a sense, in the book you're going to find a lot more detailed information about the kinds of political arguments that those who favored a state-regulated primary education system used in order to defend the creation of these systems. One of the things I should say, and let me actually go back here, is that arguments about social control have already been made when people have tried to explain the origins of mass education and how education systems function today. And so one of the key contributions of the book is to reinstate those arguments by providing a wealth of evidence that social control goals are not just a cynical interpretation of history, as some people have argued, but that social controls were in fact the primary type of goals that were behind, in most Western countries, the creation of these state-regulated systems. And so it's been particularly nice to see that in the reception of the book, people have sort of received well the emphasis that the book puts into providing a wealth of evidence on the arguments. So here you have just two recent comments people made, but again, both of these highlighting the empirically compelling argument and how much effort there is into analyzing a vast array of sources. So I hope if you have a chance to read the book that you'll enjoy going through all different types of evidence, statistical evidence, evidence of what political arguments looked like. And so with that, let me just tell you just briefly, and this is my last slide here, what are the types of evidence. So the book has the most comprehensive statistical analysis of the rise and spread of mass education in the Western world, with 2 centuries of cross-national statistical evidence on the expansion of primary schooling and on the characteristics of mass education. What did the curriculum look like? What did teacher training and recruitment look like? And so on and so forth. The book contains also a very brief intellectual history of the ideas about mass education that circulated during the 18th and 19th century that shaped this notion that you could use education to essentially convert children into obedient citizens, going through sort of ideas circulating among pietists and Enlightenment philosophers and the ruling class. The book shows with many different types of evidence this point I was making before about how it really is internal conflict against the status quo that heightens political elites' fear of the masses and leads them in response to that to invest in education for the sake of teaching children that the status quo is actually okay, that there's nothing wrong with it. And finally, it has many in-depth case studies of Prussia, France, Argentina, and Chile primarily, but also some shadow cases of England, Mexico, Peru, and the United States. And so with that, I want to thank you all ahead of time for your questions and your participation today.
Well, that was a terrific overview, and now I'm going to try and sort of drill down to a few things that I think are important or sort of shocking as somebody who even works on this, full-time every day, that I think will surprise a lot of people, even people who do education policy. And then, of course, the goal is to get lots of questions and comments from people here with us and online, so don't forget, you can send questions online through whatever platform you're on, and if you're on X, you can use hashtag CatoCEF. So I was going to ask just for the basic thesis, but we've got that, and I think the contrast, but you can tell me if this is wrong, is at least, or are you under the impression that many people think we have mass education, and that is represented by public schooling? Is the feeling you think that people commonly have that mass education was created to empower people, to give them skills so that they can then become very successful in life, economically, maybe socially, maybe culturally? Do you think that is the thesis, and is it just fundamentally wrong?
Yeah, and I think that is the thesis, and I think what I always tell people is we have to distinguish between what we think should be the goals of education, and maybe we think in this room, or at least you and I, that education should empower people, should equip people with the capabilities to live life in accordance to their own wishes, desires, and so on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that what we think education should do is what education systems actually emerged to do. And so what the book focuses on is the reality of what were governments after. And that reality does clash with these romanticized ideas that many of us learned growing up, that schools were designed to democratize access to knowledge and so on and so forth.
I can say personally, it's very nice to have someone else saying this, and in a book that is very deeply documented, because sometimes it can feel lonely saying that, well, maybe the goal of public schooling wasn't just to empower people who didn't have power. You've mentioned Prussia, and Prussia is usually, I think, the country that comes to mind first when people talk about the origins of public schooling or government-driven mass education. But I had always read and heard that the purpose behind Prussian mass education was to create basically a country of soldiers. Martinets who, as soon as the king says, we have to go to war with somebody, would be mobilized and just obey to, charge of the Light Brigade or something like that. But you say something different, and can you sort of explain the difference, what you think the origins are, and maybe where this idea of it started off that the Prussians just wanted soldiers? Yeah,
and first let me say something about why do I talk about Prussia in the book, and I mentioned it briefly today. For anyone here who works on education issues, you probably know about how these days, or in the last 10 years or so, everyone was enamored with Finland, and every country was sending education officials to Finland to figure out what is Finland doing to perform so well in PISA, and so on and so forth. Well, Prussia was in the 19th century what Finland is today to education reformers. It was the country that everyone looked up to and wanted to figure out how did Prussia get to have this primary education system. And the reason why they cared so much about Prussia was because Prussia had transitioned from being a backward economy to being a strong state and military power in Europe, and people wanted to know, okay, how did Prussia accomplish this? And what they observed was that the one thing that Prussia had that no one else had was this state-regulated primary compulsory school system. And so they thought, well, part of the reason why Prussia has this success as a state, and it's a strong state, is because it has this system in place, and we need to emulate that for strengthening our own state. Now, when you look at the kinds of arguments that were made in Prussia, I already told you, it's about breaking the child's will. And part of the reason people think that this was driven by military conflict with neighboring states in Europe is because the timing of the compulsory schooling law that introduces the first state-regulated primary education system in Prussia is 1763, which is immediately at the end of the 7 Years' War. And so people think, well, if it happened immediately after a war, it must be that it's a response to war with other countries. Now, what historians, and particularly James Melton, have documented is that actually that 1763 law has a precedent in the 1750s. Before the 7 Years' War broke out, the king had already approved essentially very similar plans. And so the question is, what led the king to already in the 1750s, before the 7 Years' War broke out, become interested in having this state-regulated primary education system. And so what historians have argued consistently is that it had a lot to do with the king's perception that there was a breakdown of social order in the countryside, in rural areas where historically you had landlords who were in charge of maintaining social order, but suddenly seigneurial authority was eroding and you needed new tools for the king to maintain social order in the periphery. And that's where the idea of using mass education emerged as a way of not fighting external enemies, but rather creating social order within the peripheries of the Prussian state.
So I think a lot of people who even maybe follow education and the history of education loosely are at least aware that Prussia was a model for people, even if I think most of the impression was it was to create soldiers who would quickly respond to external threats. Your book, though, goes way more in depth than just Prussia. And what I think probably many people don't know, at least in this country, is the role in particular of Domingo Faustino Sarmiento and the spread of mass education, in particular in Argentina and Chile. So
yeah, and so first let me say who is this Sarmiento guy. So in Argentina, he's considered the father of education, so analogous to Horace Mann, but actually even more so because it does have a national projection, his ideas, and he is the person who drafted the first national primary education law in the country. He was also president of Argentina. Under his presidency, he created the first normal schools to train teachers. But his influence over education transcends Argentina, because there was a point in time where he moved to Chile on exile, and the Chilean government sent him on a trip abroad to Europe and the United States to look at what primary education systems looked like in those countries. And when he came back from the trip, he wrote a book called Popular Education that had diffusion across Latin American countries, and that was used sort of as a template to think about what should an education system look like. And it was very heavily informed by experiences from Prussia and France in particular. Now, who is this Sarmiento person, and why did he care about education to begin with? Argentina, after independence, had a series of intermittent civil wars in which people from outside Buenos Aires were challenging the authority of Buenos Aires and the efforts of Buenos Aires elites to consolidate political authority. And Sarmiento was on the side of Buenos Aires elites, and he viewed people in the countryside who opposed Buenos Aires as savages and barbarians who had sort of this bloodthirsty manners, and he describes them as undisciplined hordes whose temper and instinct to destroy needs to be transformed and civilized and so on. And he blamed the way in which people were being raised as responsible for the civil wars. He said these people in the countryside, they are used to killing each other for fun, and they're used to killing cattle as part of what they do for a living. And so for them, violence is normalized. And so when you try to recruit them to fight a civil war against Buenos Aires, sure, they go, they join, and they don't see any issues with that. What we need to do to restore long-term peace and order in this country is to transform these people and have the state, not the parents of these kids, be the one that raises them into moral and obedient and well-mannered and well-behaved kids. And so those ideas are extremely influential in the origins of primary education in Argentina, but like I said, they also shape other countries in Latin America, also because Argentina became the country that was most admired on education issues. So in the same way that everyone was sending people to Prussia, within Latin America, people wanted to know what did Argentina do. And so its ideas, and Sarmiento's ideas in particular, also really spread throughout Latin America. Mm-hmm.
So we talked a little bit about Prussia and South America, and you have some other sort of case studies, but what's the kind of broad evidence, and there's a lot in there, and you definitely want to get the book and read the book so you can really get into it, but broad evidence, not just in individual countries, but that sort of across the globe, or at least a lot of the globe, it was this concern about sort of restive, potentially revolutionary parts of the country that drive lots of countries to adopt mass education.
Yeah, and it's sort of the pacification roots that I think that's the way you call it in your review of the book. So one of the things that I'll say is, first, the evidence of what doesn't drive education. So there's cross-national evidence that I present in the book comparing when are these systems being set up, the state-regulated primary education system, and how does it compare to the timing of democratization, how does that compare to the timing of industrialization, and so on and so forth. And you see that these systems predate democracy. They don't emerge around the time of industrialization in many cases. They predate, certainly in the case of Prussia, but also in many other cases. So you don't have good evidence that democracy or industrialization or interstate wars predict the expansion and the creation of the systems. And on the flip side, what I do show is that the strongest, most consistent cross-national predictor of the expansion of primary schooling is the occurrence of civil wars, which are one particular type of internal conflict that involves mass violence against the state. And what you see is that looking at all civil wars in Europe and Latin America from 1828 to 2015, when you look at what happens with primary school access after those civil wars, what you find is that it expands above and beyond what you would have observed in the if those wars hadn't occurred. And so then you could wonder, well, maybe governments are expanding education after a civil war because rebels wanted better education and more access to education. And so in order to get at whether that is what's driving it, I look at, well, does the curriculum look like the kind of education that rebels would want? Or other features, and that's where I see, well, no, this isn't about improving skills, this is about moral education to convert these unruly children into obedient subjects and citizens.
So I'm going to ask a little bit about the United States, but you just said something that kind of jogged my memory about Horace Mann. But so it sounds like the main thesis is, well, in a lot of places they're worried about revolution. And of course we had a revolution, but that was to create the United States. And I think a lot of people would think about US history and say, well, but this doesn't really fit us, right? Because we're about freedom and liberty, and there weren't elites who are trying to keep to prevent sort of civil war, at least coming up from the masses. Obviously, we had states that were disagreeing. But so does your thesis apply to the creation of public schooling in the United States? And what you said about concerns about savages and barbarians. So now I'm going to partially answer my own question, which is rude, but I'm going to do it. When you read Horace Mann, he actually is worried that the people kind of out in the countryside in particular are kind of savages and barbarians, but I don't remember him worrying about them being sort of aggressive. He just thought they were kind of ignorant and dangerous to themselves. But so the United States, are we not different from everybody else?
So there are definitely some differences in the United States. So one of those is that the U.S. doesn't have a national primary education system. The U.S. Constitution doesn't enable that to exist. And the other difference, I would say, is that you do have in the U.S. more so than you have in continental Europe or in Latin America during the foundational stages of creating a common school movement. You do have more people who are pushing for using education not just for social control purposes, but also for equipping kids with skills that are going to level the playing field and enable them to live, sort of make a decent living, if you want, right? That said, those sort of, despite those differences, which are real and need to be acknowledged, it is also the case that Horace Mann and many others before him as well did draw heavily on Prussia, and they saw Prussia as a model to emulate. And Horace Mann, it's quite interesting, in the very same he's perhaps most known for coining the phrase, education should serve as the great equalizer. That phrase comes from a report that he wrote as secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, in which the point of that report was to argue for the importance of common schools to have moral and political education. And he made a trip to Prussia in 1843, and he came back and said, look, in the same way that Prussia is indoctrinating kids to support an absolutist regime, we need to use the same type of structure for the perpetuation of republican institutions. I'm quoting here sort of his words. And not just him, right? After the independence war, and of course you were just saying, like, we were fighting because we wanted independence, but what happens afterwards, and this happens throughout Latin America as well, after independence wars from Portugal or Spain, elites are left with trying to figure out, okay, how do we consolidate order and the institutions that we want to establish here? And there's a lot of debate about what comes first, order or freedom. And this is where historians have sort of generally argued that in Latin America and in the US as well, political elites come down on first order and then freedom. So particularly, for instance, after Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts, there's a lot of concern about, well, people are protesting against the courts and against legislatures, and that shouldn't happen. They should respect Republican institutions. And so you have elites around the time, Benjamin Rush, Thomas Jefferson, who are saying things such as, you need to convert men into Republican machines, and so on and so forth. So you still have this tradition coming in, but it's also happening at the same time as other things are also being taught in schools.
Great. Just a reminder, if you are online and have questions, you can submit them on whatever platform you're on. We'll also be, of course, taking questions from folks here in the audience. I'm just going to ask one or two of my own, and then I will move on to audience Q&A, and then maybe I'll ask some more of my own. We'll see how it all works out. But I think that there can be difficulty. So a lot of, or a concern is that mass education was set up to create kind of obedient students, to sort of instill in them an instinctive belief that they should obey all people in position of authority. And you can certainly see how that looks in a classroom of the teacher stands in front of everybody and that you were taught this is the person who's in charge and you follow them. Is there a way, though, you can tell whether that model is in place because it is intentionally to socialize kids to be obedient to authority figures versus it's in place because they just feel like the only way I can have any order in the classroom so that I can actually teach is by being this authority figure who's, maybe dictatorial depending on how you approach discipline in your class?
Yeah, we would need to do some studies to get at that question, but I will point to one study because it's really difficult these days. I mean, back in the day, in the periods that I'm looking at, 19th century, politicians didn't really hesitate to say, our goals here is to indoctrinate kids. But if you said something like that today, that would be sort of political suicide, right? And everyone would go after you. So how do you tell what are the genuine intentions of education policymakers, for example? Well, you try to get them to reveal what they truly want to do without them really realizing that that's what they're doing. And so there's this really interesting study by the Center for Global Development where they surveyed 900 education policymakers from 36 developing countries around the world, and they ran a set of what's known as conjoint experiments that I'm happy to explain later if people want a little bit more. But essentially, they were asking people, these education policymakers, to tell them, what do you think are the main goals of education? Is it about forming dutiful citizens? Is it about forming a skilled workforce? Is it about eradicating illiteracy? And consistently, these education policymakers, the main thing that they chose was the forming dutiful citizens, not forming a skilled workforce or these other things. But of course, they were able to cleverly use research methods to get at this, because you can't just trust that people are going to reveal their true intentions when, of course, it has a very negative connotation today to look at that. One thing I think in the case of schools, one thing you could look at is how do schools respond to when students question some of the rules? Are they responding in ways that sort of, if a student asks, why can't I dye my hair pink? Because I say so. Mm-hmm. That's one approach that's sort of very focused on rules regardless of any kind of rationale behind them, whereas you could also have a situation in which the teacher explains to the student, if there is a good reason for it, engages in a conversation with the student, but you would have to see on a case-by-case basis, how are the schools responding to when students question some of the norms? Are they immediately labeling them as deviant, as unruly, or are they taking seriously some of the questions that students might ask? Which would be more common, sort of more characteristic of a democratic society, right, where people can express freely and debate and so on and so forth. So you would have to look a little bit about those interactions, I think. Mm-hmm.
All right, so we're about to open it up to audience Q&A. I will say I have maybe an unusual rule, but since everybody always breaks the old rules, I just gave up. So ideally you have a question, but if you have a comment and can keep it short, it's fine with me if you have a comment. Just don't filibuster or we'll have to cut you off. But since I always, people are always saying, oh, just a question, please, not a comment. And that actually seems to encourage people who, I guess everybody who comes to a libertarian event is a rule breaker. And they're like, oh, I'm going to give you a really long comment. So what I say is go ahead and give me a comment. And then typically I just end up getting questions. So it works out. But if you want to have a short comment, that is also fine. So we'll start off. We have several people here in the audience. I'll start. Oh, you have your hand up and someone's pointing at you, so you definitely get to go first. Oh, just wait. Oh, sorry. Also wait for the microphone to arrive so everyone can hear.
Hi. My name is McCluskey. Deirdre McCluskey. I'm at the Cato Institute, and I have the same last name as our host. There's an earlier motivation for mass education, which is religious, and I'd like to hear your opinions on it. For example, in 1603 in Scotland, a Calvinist country, mass education was authorized and imposed. In the 17th century in Poland, the Jesuits took over education with sharply religious consequences. And of course, in our own day, there are the impositions of religious schools in some Islamic countries. So how does that argument fit with your extremely persuasive and interesting arguments about fear of the masses?
No, absolutely. So I'm glad you brought that up because we didn't have a chance to talk about that. So essentially what you had historically is that the education of children was left to families, local communities, and the church. This is precisely what you're bringing up. And moral education was something that was primarily the purview of families, but also the church and religious authorities. So what I note in the book, so the point of the book isn't explaining those origins. The point of the book is to explain, okay, if that was the way it used to be, why does the state at some point become involved in this idea? And what happens is that at some point, depending on the country, and usually this is again triggered by the occurrence of some form of internal conflict, political elites come to the conclusion that the existing policy tools that they have, including leaving moral education entirely to the church, that's insufficient to promote social order, that they need to do something different in the realm of policy to better maintain social order moving forward. And so in some contexts, depending on the country, the state says we're going to displace the church. We're going to be the ones who fully take on this agenda of moral education. And in other contexts, which is certainly the case of Prussia, they don't do it sort of by displacing, they do it in alliance with pietist education reformers, saying, well, let's build on each other's knowledge, expertise, resources, and so on, and work together for the promotion of an education system that's larger in scale, by the way, that's more extended also in terms of the number of days you're in school, and so on, but where the state is relying in part on the church's moral authority to promote this obedience, but now not just obedience to God, but also obedience to the king, in the case of Prussia, and obedience to the state more generally. So I'm glad you bring this up, because sort of the idea that you could use mass education to use to do moral education and to convert people into well-behaved individuals and so on didn't really originate with the state. It's an idea that the state borrowed from the church and then took it to larger scale and adapted it to its own purposes, which was about loyalty to the state and obedience to the state's authority and rules.
Yeah, for people who are really interested in the religious aspect in here, there's a lot about pietism, which I had no idea had such an influence. I don't know how in-depth you want to go on pietism right now, but so that is a major component of it that I had not thought about. So what I'm going to try and do is sort of go back and forth in the room, and then if we get some good online questions, we'll go to the online. So you may have had your hand up first over there. I'm going to try and go over there and just bounce back and forth. So, sir, right sort of in the second row, and just remember to wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. It seems that you're developing a dichotomy, which I'm not sure really exists, between talking about empowering versus obedience. It seems in the idea if empowering, if we're not empowering everyone to be a philosopher, we're also empowering people to be engineers and scientists and lawyers and business people and doctors, whatever they may. These people function in a society, in an industrialized society, where you need a certain amount of conformity to work in a factory, to study a discipline, to be an engineer, to be a chemist. And I'm wondering if certain things that empower people to be innovative, really depending upon them working in a structure, which I think, if you want to be a developed society, imposes a certain amount of conformity and obedience. So it seems the way I see it, you're developing a dichotomy that really doesn't exist in reality.
Thank you. So I think that maybe we're using the word empowering in a different way. So the way that I think of what should be the goal of education, I think primarily about the goal of developing personal autonomy, giving people the capabilities to live life freely, to choose what path they want to pursue, and to have the tools to pursue that path. And so from that standpoint, I think there's very little to be debated, that in order to live an autonomous life, you need very strong critical thinking skills. You need critical thinking skills to be able to assess alternative life paths, to be able to figure out what might be best for you, and so on and so forth. And you need critical thinking skills for a range of different things to live this empowered life, at least the way that I define it, okay? And so when you're teaching education in a way that suppresses critical thinking, which is what I argue is this design of education systems originally intends to do. It's about obedience and about suppressing critical thinking. It's about teaching kids to accept certain ideas without question. Then that comes into conflict with the agenda of producing an education that truly empowers people. But I think you have a potentially different definition of what empowerment looks like. And so that might be where our disagreement comes from.
All right, so I'll go over here and then I'll hit the middle sections after that. So, yes, sir.
Okay, my name is David Hoffman. This is a most impressive and persuasive book and argument. But let me raise a question deriving from sort of a counter tradition. Doesn't really, they often say two things can be true at the same time. But the second thing arises way back with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course in the 18th century, somewhat of a general will, sort of democratic whatever. John Dewey in the 1930s, democracy being his sort of view that schools should encourage kids to become young Democrats, large D or even small d. Here's my question. In the 1960s, we had various people, Ivan Illich wrote about deschooling society. I was in England in the 1960s, and I remember that the primary schools, the English primary schools, somewhat followed in the footsteps of Alec Neil and, of course, his book Summerhill, which was really a radical libertarian view that kids didn't even need to go to school, certainly not compulsory. So my question is, with this somewhat radical counter-tradition in which people argued that kids should be free and even society should be deschooled, what do you make of that argument?
Thank you. So let me first clarify a few things with respect to Rousseau, because you brought that up, and I talk about it in the book. Rousseau's ideas on mass education were very different from his ideas on education for the masses. He was really focused on obedience. I think with John Dewey, you're absolutely right that he did have a different type of education in mind, and many historians have said, well, John Dewey was able to become this person that was really promoting something radically different from what existed at the time and is considered progressive and so on, precisely because of what came before, right? The ideas he was proposing was not what the public school system looked like. Now, on to your question, what do I think about deschooling society and essentially not having a compulsory education system, letting kids choose if they want not to go to school, right? So again, this goes back to my earlier response that I do think that it is important to equip students with the capabilities to live autonomous lives. And that does require potentially some sort of state presence in which the state is saying, well, maybe we're not gonna have a huge role, and that's to be debated how much of a role the state should have, but that there is someone who is protecting the child from potentially having parents who do not want the child to be educated because they just want the child to continue working in the farm or in whatever the parent wants them to work on, and the kid doesn't really develop that freedom. And so to the extent that you believe that education is important for living a free life, then I think there's a role there for requiring that kids get the kind of education that would enable them to live that free life.
All right, just a reminder, if you're online, you can send questions. I'm going to ask one online in a moment, but I promised I would go to the middle. There are a lot of hands in the middle, though, so this is a tough one. So there's a young man sort of in the back row. Actually, if you'll just take the microphone over, whichever one looks like the hand you want to give it to, let's go with that, because I can't differentiate.
I'll start from this side.
All right, that works.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that talk. It was really, really interesting. I just want to build on what you were talking about being empowered. So you mentioned that all people to be empowered sort of need to have capability as well as having tools and critical thinking skills. I guess I was just wondering that under any education system, you're going to have stakeholders and investors who ultimately have some sort of bias, whether it's the church, as mentioned earlier, or the government, or a private investor. And surely the choice to live in whatever country you live in is an acceptance and subscription of those values promoted by that education system. And, you know, realistically, for a lot of people, there's no viable alternative for education beyond free state education. So I guess I was wondering that at least under a state education, we see education systems constantly being critiqued and shifted under changing government regimes, as well as equipping students both from an academic perspective, but also, as mentioned earlier, from a social perspective for jobs, the workforce, and the general structure of the country in which they live in. So I suppose my question is the current state really so bad, even if children are raised to obey? And if so, what is a viable alternative?
There were a lot of things in your question that you said, and I didn't follow everything you said in connection to the very end of the question. So let me speak primarily to the very end of your question. Because I think that there's a valid question about how would someone that defends the current education system respond to the book? And I think it's a very common misconception that the book provides support for privatizing education and getting rid of public schools. That's not an implication of the book, because the book doesn't provide any evidence at all about how much indoctrination would there be under a private school system, okay? So, and as I was responding previously to Dr. McCluskey's question, the idea that you could use education to indoctrinate kids and instill specific moral values really emerged with a non-state actor, with churches, right? So I think that there is a question that people have in mind about, well, what would be a better alternative? And I think that a better alternative could be, whether it's public or it's private, I think it speaks to the point of what's the type of society in which you live. I think in a democratic society, which is what the US and many other countries have, a different approach would be more of the Dewey style approach, in which people are debating what are the values we want to teach. If there are indeed common values that we want everyone to learn, not have those be imposed from the top, but have a societal debate about what are the values that we can actually agree on, that we think are values that we all share. And so based on that, you would have also the setup of the schools would be a more democratic setup in which the kids are also participating in choosing which projects they want to work on, in which the kids are also participating in informing some of the rules that the schools use, and also having conversations about, well, what happens if you don't follow these rules? So Dewey had a particular set of ideas, and I think that that's sort of a more democratic approach to education that at a minimum should be part of the conversation and debated.
Well, sorry. Real quick follow-up, since the microphone's heading to the other, but we do have other questions, so.
Does a Republican system not sort of lend a degree of credence to that system as it stands currently, where you've got a mandate given to a state education department, which then has some sort of power over curriculum?
Yeah, I think we should talk one-on-one later, because I'm not following entirely. So I think there are some assumptions behind your question.
And I'll just say, to fill in a little more, there's a whole thing called a pluralist model, Charles Glenn, Ashley Rogers Berner, that gets into this. And also, shameless plug for me, I wrote a book all about this topic called The Fractured Schoolhouse, which you can get outside when the event's over. So enjoy that. I'm going to go to an online question, which is related, I think, to somebody else's question, but it's very direct.
Okay.
So it doesn't take me long at all. The question is just, and it's from Anonymous, so I'm sorry I don't know who you are, but does a state need order?
Does a state need?
Does it need order?
That's not for me to answer. I think that that's always been the debate underlying education systems among politicians is, do we need order to have prosperity? Or can we have prosperity without imposing order first? And so I'm not a stateswoman. What I do is I study politicians, and what I can say is that historically, the agreement most political elites in the Western world came to was that, yes, you actually needed order before you could have prosperity. And I think I'm glad that someone brought this question up, because I think it's worth always revisiting ideas and thinking through things deeply. And so maybe as part of a different talk, we could debate that.
That'll be part 2. We'll have to schedule
Yeah.
that.
But
okay.
I mean, these were the debates people were having, and so I wouldn't be able to address that question. I think it'd be really fascinating to go through all of the various arguments that people made in favor and against this.
Yeah, and that does go a little beyond just the education system.
Exactly.
It's a little more fundamental.
Exactly.
So we're gonna go over here. There's a young lady. Oh, yes, here comes the microphone.
Thank you. I appreciated your presentation. So my name is Eleftheria. I'm from Harvard, and I wanted to ask, does your research have implications on the subject matter of education to induce critical thinking? Because we're talking a lot about critical thinking in recent decades, but not so much as to the subject matter, and there's plenty of disagreement. And to give some context to my question, so in the beginning of the 20th century, at least in higher education, which is on the news now, there was a lot of discussion about what kind of subject matter, what kind of courses, what kind of sources should be used to create a free and equal citizenry, and what it means to be a free citizen in a democracy, what kind of things you might want to read. And there was a role for higher education back in the early 20th century, not so much of a role today, I would argue. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on this? And I understand that your research is not on higher education, but I would like to listen to your opinion on the subject matter consequences of your research. Thank you.
Sure. And I'm glad you pointed out that the book is not about higher education, so I'm gonna keep my answers to the things that I can speak to from an informed perspective. So I think that the question you're raising is, what does the curriculum actually look like when the goal is to promote critical thinking? That's a question that we need to consider. We haven't ever had policymakers sitting down at a table to think, how do we design an education system that is primarily focused on promoting critical thinking? And I could imagine different ways of going about that. And since we don't have a lot of experience, we don't know which of those different approaches would be the most effective. So there would also be a learning process around that. A student-centered model, there's different types of student-centered models, right? So we would have to do a lot of testing, trial and testing, to figure out what would be the best approach. But I think the question you're answering, it's sort of premature in some ways to answer, to give a confident response to that, because that's precisely what we haven't had much of, is an education system where the beginning of the design of the system is, this is about promoting critical thinking, about creative thinking, free thinking, and so on and so forth. So what does the classroom setup look like? It's not just about the curriculum, it's also about how do you arrange the infrastructure of the classroom. Is it rows sitting sort of like that and the teacher standing in front? Is that what's more likely to promote critical thinking, or is there a different setup? These are all the things that we need to be debating as we rethink education as something that is primarily centered on not obedience, but critical thinking.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'll take two more questions here, then I have a question of my own to kind of wrap things up. And maybe if the questions are short, I can get some more in. But I'm going to go right here in the middle, sort of almost right behind the monitor. So could you raise your hand way up? Now everybody's doing it, of course. So 2 rows back. Kayla, could you? I'll keep pointing with my pen, which is very imprecise. Well, that wasn't what I was going for, but that's okay because it's really hard to. I need a laser pointer, but I don't want to hurt anybody.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, when you were talking about a more democratic system of education and actually factoring what students want, what the teachers want, etc., I don't think that really accounts for like external indoctrination, right? Like whether it's religious, whether it's from a family, whether it's political. So how do you balance kind of what the majority wants and taking kind of like a populist approach, and actually the school's obligation to provide, to encourage moral citizenry, like growing good, to however you would like to define that, moral citizens, and what the majority wants to be taught.
Can you say more about?
Sorry?
Can you say more about what you have in mind? Where do you see the tension?
Like, for example, if the majority of society conforms to a certain religious ideology, and they want to be taught like that, but that conflicts with certain moral ideologies, etc. Like, how do you, if the society is uniform, then your education that they want and that they're going to ask for is going to be uniform, and it's not going to encourage critical thinking. So how do you balance that in a democratic education system?
Yeah. This is going to be maybe controversial, right? But again, I think the focus should be on raising a child that is free, that can think freely and think for himself. So this isn't even about what do the parents think is the best education for their child. Because again, you could have a parent who what they want is for the kid to be an extension of themselves and for the kid's dreams to be the parents' dreams. Okay, so I would be interested in having a conversation about what does it look like when a majority of society wants a particular set of values to be imposed on kids, and that infringes on the kids' ability to develop the capacities to live the free life. And I think that would be problematic. Now, what I do think can happen is for schools to have a plurality of different perspectives in which maybe you are presenting the perspective of the majority, as you called it, but the kid is also exposed to alternative perspectives on interpretation of history or what are the right moral values that one should have. And in that context, you're both exposed to the majority's preferred ideas and to additional ideas, and you're letting the child, through the development of critical thinking and also introspection, choose what kind of life and what kind of values they want to subscribe to.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. So again, this is the pluralist model. And if you want to dig more into this, again, you can get my book, The Fractured Schoolhouse, which should be your first stop, is getting that book. But also, Charles Glenn and Ashley Rogers Berner probably write the most about systems like in England where they try and balance the ability to get an education consistent with a family's worldviews, but that also doesn't restrict a child to that. I think there are lots of issues about how that works. I'm not a huge fan of it, but in the grand spectrum of delivering education, it's a lot better than the government decides, in my opinion. But you can really get deeply into that. And probably Ashley Rogers Berner is the first one to look. She wrote a book called No One Way to School about 10 years ago that dives into that.
So can I jump in on something, though, that you just said? So,
sure, it's a free-for-all.
Because I don't think this is necessarily about the government itself, because the government could decide, but it could do so through this deliberative model in which different perspectives are being used to inform what are the diverse perspectives out there in society, and then as part of the school curriculum, those various perspectives are being incorporated so that you can still have a plural education, even though there is room for the state to say this is what the curriculum should look like, because the curriculum of the state could be itself plural.
Oh, right. So they get it. I don't want to go too far into this because I don't want to do all the talking, but that's a whole part of the pluralist model is trying to empower government. I may be phrasing this wrong, but to make sure kids are exposed to things that they think every child should be exposed to and tolerance of others, but to also not have the government take over such that a family with a particular religious worldview is told, well, you can't get education that's consistent with that worldview, other than it's taught as 20 other worldviews that are all equally valid. So it's trying to balance these things that, has been part of the education debate forever of, who gets to decide what kids learn, and then we get this deeper discussion of and what enables a child to become an autonomous adult. So, but I don't want to talk anymore because who wants to hear me? And we've only got about 2 minutes left, so we'll do one more question, and then I have a question for you. So I was aiming right here, sort of behind the monitor, and yeah, right. Okay, you're going. Oh, we did it.
Thank you. My name is Kenny Tan. I've been working in the private education sector for the past 15 years. As I think about the legacy that I leave in this world, I want to have a greater impact on the students that I work with. And so I've been playing around with the idea of creating a preschool and a primary school for kids in my neighborhood. Starting it out maybe as like a daycare or early learning center and then building it up 1 year at a time. So I'm curious what suggestions you might have for creating a model primary school that eventually could be used as a model for other education systems.
Yeah, I think when you're starting off that young, you know how curious kids are innately, right? That they explore things and they eyes open, they want to learn about everything. So the main thing I would say is don't crush that curiosity. Let the kids lead, explore. There are different existing curricula out there that put the child at the center of the learning process, that where the child is leading that, and that you're essentially just feeding that curiosity as opposed to trying the kid to sort of mold him into sitting still. There are some approaches to daycare and preschool where the kids are already sitting still as opposed to moving around, exploring, playing, and being creative. And so I would go more toward those less structured. They do have a structure of their own, actually, but it's not just like kids sitting down. It's more about learning through play, learning through exploration, and so on and so forth. I think that that's the kind of thing where the kid maintains a sense of autonomy, and then you're helping strengthen that through the education system.
Great. I have to take a comment from somebody online because it's complementing something that Cato does, so I have to say this. Betty Nordengren, thank you, Betty, for saying this. Cato's Sphere Education Program is actually doing solid work fostering critical thinking and discussion materials for U.S. teachers. So if you don't know about our Sphere Education Initiative, look it up online. And then I'm just going to combine two questions for you, real fast. So what's the reception of the book been like, and what's your next project?
I'm first, with the reception of the book, I've just been thrilled that there's so many different types of audiences that have responded well to it. So you have people on the right and on the left of the political spectrum that are learning valuable things. And so that, for me, has always been really important, to just be able to foster debate among people who maybe to begin with they don't all agree, but to find some common ground, because I think there's more common ground than we maybe often notice. So that's been wonderful, and the book has also been really well received across many different disciplines. You mentioned I'm a political scientist, but the book has been very well received among economists and historians and sociologists and education experts, so that's also been really, really nice. Next book, maybe that's a little premature for me to say, but I will say one thing that I'm very curious to learn more about is, okay, if governments have this incentive or have had this incentive to use education to teach people that there's nothing wrong with the status quo because they're concerned about if they were to teach something different, people might rebel against the government. If that's an underlying concern, then under what conditions can a government become interested and motivated to reform its education system and in fact transform it in a way that supports a different type of education, that promotes autonomy, that promotes critical thinking, and so on and so forth. So that's what I would want to know. And that may be the next book.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to that. I think everyone else is also. I want to thank you especially for coming and joining us today. I want to thank everybody for coming online, everybody who's here. And this concludes our event, but you can head upstairs for lunch and continue discussion amongst yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.